Tonight we talk about the scandalous banquets of Louis XIV's Versailles nights. So dazzling they made daylight look embarrassed. You can almost hear the rustle of silk echoing down those mirrored halls. The faint clink of crystal trembling beneath chandeliers heavy enough to crush modesty itself. The air smells of beeswax and roasted pheasant, of perfume so thick it could drown a moth mid-flight. You probably won't survive this one, not because of scandal or swordplay, but because you'll choke on the sheer decadence of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the golden gates of Versailles, boots crunching on gravel imported just to make the right sound when nobles arrived. The palace looms ahead, a vast organism of light and gossip, pulsing with candle flames that refuse to rest. It's late, but Versailles never sleeps. Inside, the walls glitter with mirrors so bright they double the arrogance in every room. You catch your reflection and, for a second, believe you belong. Everyone here pretends they do. Louis XIV, the Sun King, has built this palace not merely as a home, but as a gravitational field. Everything revolves around him, from the tides of conversation to the timing of digestion. When the king eats, France eats. When he yawns, courtiers collapse into synchronized exhaustion. And when he smiles, entire fortunes rise from despair. At tonight's banquet, he plans to show Europe that even hunger can serve a crown. Long tables stretch like golden runways under chandeliers of Venetian glass. Every seat is an audition, every gesture a negotiation. The musicians tune softly in the corner, and somewhere, a servant spills a drop of wine and nearly his career. You find yourself drawn toward the sound of laughter, a sharp, tinkling kind that hides claws beneath lace. Courtiers float by, powdered and perfumed, their wigs taller than their wit. They carry fans like weapons, using a flick or a flutter to signal alliances or ruin reputations. The perfume is unbearable, but it's better than the truth. Versailles smells of sweat and fear beneath its rosewater fouade. Historians still argue whether these endless feasts were acts of genius or madness. Some claim Louis designed them as political theater to distract nobles from rebellion. With roast goose and gossip, others think he simply adored being adored, his appetite for admiration outmatching his appetite for mate. The truth, as with the sauces here, is thick and complicated. A servant, one of hundreds, passes with a tray stacked with oysters from Brittany, still glistening with seawater. You take one and instantly regret it. It's so cold it burns. Yet everyone around you eats as if each bite confirms their existence. This isn't dining, it's devotion. Even the smallest crumb becomes a prayer to the Sun King. In one corner, a lady whispers to her companion that the sugar sculptures tonight are modeled after the gods of Olympus. You glance toward the centerpiece and find Zeus himself, crafted entirely of spun sugar and arrogance. His thunderbolt is a caramel twist. Someone jokes that it will melt before dessert, and so, apparently, will several marriages. The chandeliers flare brighter as the king enters, wearing diamonds that could fund a revolution and a smile that already has. He walks slowly, deliberately, the room bowing in waves before him. You bow too, though your knees tremble from more than admiration. You realize, as the orchestra begins to play, that you've stepped into a world where beauty is compulsory, hunger is political, and no one, not even the king, can afford to leave the table first. The feast has only begun. The trumpets sound, and suddenly the hall transforms into a living theater. You realize Louis XIV never hosts a meal, he performs one. The king's table gleams like a galaxy, its silverware aligned with cosmic precision, its glasses catching the candlelight like captive suns. You watch him take his seat at the center of it all, and it hits you. Versailles is not a palace. It's a stage where food, fashion, and flattery perform in perfect synchronization. Servants move in near silence, hundreds of them, gliding like clockwork. Each knows precisely when to bow, when to pour, when to vanish into the walls like ghosts with impeccable posture. The king's spoon alone has its own protocol, touched by gloved hands only, placed at the precise angle of 22 degrees, because apparently geometry itself must honor the crown. Historians still argue whether Louis enforced these details for control, or simply for the joy of seeing order manifest around him. You lean closer as the first course arrives, gilded tureens holding soups so delicate they could offend gravity. The aroma swirls through the air: nutmeg, truffle, and an audacious hint of cinnamon from the Indies. The courtiers gasp softly. Every spoonful is diplomacy. These ingredients come from colonies and seas most of them will never see. But to eat them here is to confirm that the Sun King's reach knows no horizon. As musicians play a gentle gavotte in the background, Louis glances at the crowd, and the temperature of the room seems to shift. One noble laughs too loudly at a royal jest. Another coughs at the wrong moment and earns 3 weeks of invisibility. You begin to understand the tension beneath the glitter. Versailles is less about indulgence and more about survival. Everyone here is performing loyalty, even as they quietly plot their next invitation. At your side, a lady wearing pearls the size of grapes leans in and whispers, "Watch his hands." You follow her advice. Louis gestures once, and a servant rushes to refill his glass. He raises an eyebrow, and a new dish appears: pigeon pie with candied rose petals. Each motion is a cue, each bite a declaration. When the king eats, "We exist," she murmurs, half reverent, half resigned. A rumor circulates down the table. Someone claims the royal pâtissier once spent 3 days sculpting a jelly that could wobble in the shape of the king's monogram. You can't tell if it's true, but it feels right. Versailles runs on the logic that anything absurd might be mandatory. One wit jokes that the cooks have invented gravity itself to please Louis's appetite, then immediately pretends it was someone else who said it. The orchestra swells, and dancers glide between the tables, their satin shoes whispering across the marble. Even dinner is choreographed, each pause in the music timed to the next course. You half expect applause after the roasted swans arrive, plucked, painted gold, and stuffed with smaller birds as if nature needed improvement. The scent of roasting fat mingles with jasmine and beeswax, a perfume so overwhelming it makes your stomach and your conscience uneasy. For a fleeting moment, you glimpse the king's eyes, tired, perhaps, or simply satisfied with the world he's devoured. It's said he dined in public to remind everyone that he was France. You believe it. The Sun King doesn't just consume his meal, he consumes attention, affection, obedience. And tonight, as goblets rise and laughter ripples like warm wine, he seems to feed on the very act of being watched. Someone behind you mutters that the bread alone could bankrupt a province. You smile, pretending it's a joke, but you sense the truth buried beneath the sugar. Here, excess is not a sin, it's policy. The feast unfolds like a symphony, each sense tuned to a royal key. You can feel the pulse of luxury vibrating through the marble floors, as though the building itself is humming approval. The heat from hundreds of candles presses gently against your skin, mingling with the buttery warmth of roasted quail and the cool sparkle of wine. Here, eating is not simply nourishment, it's theater, seduction, and politics wrapped in pastry. The first scent to reach you is orange blossom imported from Spain, distilled in the royal orangery, and sprinkled onto linen just to prove that flowers, too, serve the crown. Then comes the aroma of venison glazed in cherry sauce, so rich it could start a minor rebellion. Every fragrance seems staged, and perhaps it is. Rumor claims Louis XIV had the air perfumed before every meal so that the scents would harmonize with the dishes. Historians still argue whether this was vanity or early aromatherapy. You decide it's probably both. The sounds of Versailles are just as deliberate. Forks don't clink, they whisper. Music drifts in from the next hall, lutes and viols weaving melodies around conversation. When someone laughs too loudly, the orchestra swells to cover the offense. Even the silence between courses feels rehearsed, an elegant pause, like an inhale before another indulgent sigh. Across the table, a nobleman dabs at his lips with a napkin embroidered with gold thread, pretending to listen to a duchess who's actually describing her new spaniel's diet. You're not sure whether to laugh or curtsy. One servant drops a platter of pastries, and the gasp that follows sounds rehearsed. Too like a collective chord of horror and delight, you catch sight of the king again. He doesn't just eat, he conducts. With a tilt of his head, he sets a rhythm for the entire table. Plates are replaced, goblets replenished, laughter recalibrated. It's mesmerizing and mildly terrifying. One wrong movement could ripple through the ranks like a scandalous echo. You remember the saying whispered through the corridors at Versailles, "You dine on decorum or you starve on silence." A dish arrives that nearly defies physics, a pie of larks. 40 birds baked into one crust, each layered with herbs from Provence. The crust gleams with beaten egg and ambition. You can taste rosemary, thyme, and the faint flavor of fear the cooks, perhaps. The king takes a bite and nods once. The room exhales in relief. You lean back, your senses half drunk on opulence. The mirrors along the walls multiply every shimmer, making it seem as if Versailles stretches into infinity. One lady jokes softly that she's developed mirror fatigue, which, if real, would be the palace's only honest ailment. Somewhere, a poet scribbles verses about divine appetite. You suspect the muse has indigestion. A new curiosity arrives, tiny sugar-coated seeds from India, meant to cleanse the breath. They sparkle like jewels and taste like a strange mixture of heaven and pharmacy. One courtier insists they can cure melancholy. Another claims they make you dream of wealth. You pop one into your mouth and immediately taste the empire sweet, distant, and slightly unsettling. Everything here, says a voice beside you, exists to remind us we are small. You turn and find a philosopher well, a man who looks like one smiling behind a wig slightly too large for his intellect. And yet, he continues, we pretend it's all for pleasure. You nod, but your attention drifts toward the king's plate. The gold-rimmed porcelain glows under the candlelight, and you notice how cleanly he eats, how deliberate every motion is. This is not hunger, it's dominion. Somewhere deep inside, you wonder whether the Sun King ever truly tasted his own food, or whether the flavor of power was enough. You start to notice that the real drama isn't on the plate, sits beneath them. Behind every polished silver dome lies a secret, a scheme, or a sigh disguised as laughter. Versailles doesn't serve food. It serves stories baked in scandal. The courtiers' smiles glisten like the sauces, but their eyes betray the same ambition that seasons every dish. The king's table may be a vision of order, yet chaos simmers just beyond the gilded edges. Servants glide by, bearing delicacies from every corner of France, but your attention keeps snagging on the murmurs. Gossip moves faster than gravy here. One duchess leans close to a marquis, her fan hiding her lips as she whispers something that makes his powdered face blanch. Beneath the rouge, you try not to stare, though everyone else does. They say that at Versailles, who you sit beside can change your future. A misplaced chair has toppled more than one career. The seating chart itself, hand-drawn by trembling officials, is practically sacred. To sit too close to the king without invitation is treason by proximity. To sit too far is social exile. Historians still argue whether Louis enjoyed orchestrating this tension or merely tolerated it as part of the spectacle. Either way, the anxiety is almost fragrant. You glance toward the king. His eyes flick briefly to the Comtesse de Soissons, a beauty whose smile could curdle cream. She's rumored to dabble in poisons, though no one can prove it. Her presence alone is enough to make the soup taste suspicious. Nearby, another courtier whispers that her fan hides more than perfume, that it conceals coded messages. Past two lovers between bites. You try to laugh it off, but the air feels thicker now, heavy with cinnamon and conspiracy. The servants, well-trained in discretion, move like shadows. One slips, almost imperceptibly, and you catch a glimpse of the kitchen door beyond, a chaotic inferno of copper pots, shouting chefs, and bubbling sauces thick as molten gold. You wonder how many secrets are cooked there alongside the pheasants. It's said that Louis's spies sometimes posed as kitchen boys, listening for muttered grievances over boiling stockpots. You picture a young servant stirring soup with one hand and empire with the other. The next course arrives, lobster in saffron butter, served on porcelain so delicate it trembles when you breathe too close. Across the table, the Duc d'Orléans leans back, laughing a little too loudly at a story you suspect involves the Queen's cousin. His mistress, seated 2 places away, pretends not to hear, though her fingernails leave tiny crescents in the tablecloth. Every smile here hides a bruise. Every toast masks a dare. Do you think he knows everything? Someone murmurs near you. You don't answer. Of course the king knows. Versailles is designed so that every glance finds its way back to him. Every whisper feeds his omniscience. You can't help feeling watched even by the Scandalous. A jester like wit at the far end raises his glass and jokes. The Sun King shines even on our stomachs. The laughter that follows is strained, calculated like sugar stretched to thin. Louis smirks, amused or dangerous. It's impossible to tell. The orchestra begins another piece. Strings sighing softly as dessert appears. Fruits carved into shapes of mythic beasts. Glowing under the candlelight, you spot a melon sculpted into a sphinx, a pear polished like a miniature moon. But behind the sweetness, you can taste the tension. Someone here will fall out of favor by morning. Someone always does. You take another sip of wine, cool, sharp, treacherous, and realize that beneath all this glitter, Versailles is a battlefield fought with glances, not blades. The king may dine on delicacies, but everyone else dines on fear. You begin to learn that dining at Versailles is less about appetite and more about choreography. Every gesture, every glance, every forkful is part of a delicate ballet. Pick up your knife too eagerly, and the court gasps. Linger over your wine too long, and someone interprets it as insolence. Eating here is a performance with stakes higher than any duel. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV intended these rules as control or merely as an art form. But you can feel the tension pressing against your ribs like a corset. The etiquette alone could exhaust you. Napkins must be folded precisely, spoons balanced, elbows hovering above the table not for comfort, but for survival. Courtiers whisper that a single misstep could erase decades of favor. You remember the warning of a particularly anxious chamberlain at Versailles. To misplace a fork is to misplace your destiny. You swallow, not sure whether to laugh or shiver. Across from you, a young marquis wipes his mouth with a golden napkin, trying to mask a nervous tremor. His neighbor leans in, offering advice disguised as gossip. Always follow the king's eye. Never precede him. And whatever you do, don't sneeze while a duchess is speaking. You nod, taking mental notes, while secretly thinking that modern dining rules are far less dangerous. Then again, your Instagram posts won't cost you a duchy. Between courses, the subtle politics continue to stir. One lady murmurs that a certain nobleman has lost favor due to a poorly timed compliment. Another laughs, mentioning that the king notices everything, down to the shine on your boots. You try to keep pace with the unspoken language, the invisible ledger of alliances and grudges maintained beneath the porcelain and silverware. And then there's the fringe curiosity, a rumor that a courtier once replaced salt with powdered sugar in the king's dish, just to see what would happen. You imagine the panic, the whispered accusations, the scandalous whispers carried through Versailles like a candle flame, threatening to topple a mirror. No one knows if it's true, and yet everyone pretends to. The courses roll on, pheasant glazed with honey, peas blanched to perfection, tarts bursting with currants. Every bite is an affirmation of power, every sip a reminder that you are small. Even when seated at the longest table in Europe, you can almost taste the empire itself, sweet, ambitious, and faintly bitter at the edges. A hush falls over the hall as the king lifts his fork for the next dish. You realize the entire room holds its breath, not out of hunger, but because his attention is the only seasoning that matters. The tiniest misstep could unbalance the delicate lattice of privilege and favor that binds Versailles together. You feel a little dizzy, not from wine, but from the sheer, suffocating precision of it all. Amid all this discipline, there are moments of quiet rebellion. A servant hides a tiny morsel in his sleeve. A young courtier hums an off-key tune. These tiny acts are swallowed by the grandeur, like crumbs lost in a feast, but they remind you that humans, even in the heart of opulence, cannot completely suppress their nature. As the next course is served, a pie sculpted like a miniature fortress, you think about how food here is not sustenance. It is a weapon, a statement, a subtle threat wrapped in sugar and silk. And you, observer or participant, are caught in the delicious tension, teetering between awe and exhaustion. Amid the gleaming silver and perfumed air, the ladies of Versailles quietly stage their own intrigues. You notice the way the Comtesse de Lafayette leans toward the Marquis de Villiers, a flick of her fan punctuating a whispered joke. Behind every sip of champagne, every delicate bite of pâtisserie, alliances are being forged and broken. The courtiers' wives are the invisible directors of this ballet, orchestrating subtle flurries of favor and flirtation while the men glittering and anxious follow the rhythm. Historians still argue whether these maneuvers were mere entertainment or the lifeblood of court politics, but watching them, you can't help but believe in their deadly seriousness. The table sparkles under the glow of thousands of candles, and the women move among it like shadows in silk. One leans over to touch the sleeve of a young marquise. Another adjusts the placement of her tiara, making sure it catches the light just right as she tilts her head toward the king. Even the laughter is choreographed soft, musical, yet capable of slicing through reputation like a well-honed knife. You're reminded of the whispered legend that some ladies of the court once arranged to pass secret notes folded into napkins, messages disguised as etiquette, perhaps even as love letters meant to influence policy. You feel your attention drawn to the subtle power struggle hidden beneath a dish of spun sugar. The Marquise de Montespan smiles at the king with calculated abandon, her eyes sparking with mischief and ambition. She's rumored to have a hand in almost every significant scandal of the decade. Yet tonight she wears nothing but silk and pearls, as if innocence could mask influence. A scholar might ask whether her charm was politics, art, or survival strategy, and you suspect the answer is some cocktail of all three. Served chilled with a slice of candied orange, music drifts in, masking the occasional hiss of scandal like velvet over steel. A lady taps her fan lightly against the edge of her wineglass, signaling some invisible code that you cannot hope to decipher. You imagine that one wrong response here could mean social exile or worse, a whisper that echoes in Versailles long after the candles burn down. Meanwhile, the champagne flows freely, frothing like tiny waves in crystal goblets. You sip, wondering whether anyone is drinking or merely performing the act of drinking. Like actors in a play that never ends. Between bites of delicate pate and the occasional stolen truffle, the women glide around the table, planting the seeds of influence as subtly as powdered sugar dusts a tart. Even dessert is dangerous. You notice a petite confection shaped like a miniature rose, placed just within reach of a young diplomat. The lady beside him offers a faintly conspiratorial smile. Was it an invitation, a warning, or simply a sweet to mask ambition? You suspect all three, somewhere behind the gilded mirrors. A whispered jest reaches your ear. A lady claims that the king notices everything, even the angle of a fan held by an unremarkable courtier. You glance at Louis XIV, serene yet vigilant, and can almost believe it. He is the sun, after all, and all these flirtations orbit him. Basking in his glare or hiding in his shadow, the night hums with possibility. You sip wine again, tasting honey and politics, silk and strategy. You realize that in this dazzling theater, the real delicacy isn't the food, it's the maneuvering. The subtle dances of charm and power, performed as casually as lifting a fork. By the time the last toast is made, the kingdom itself feels like a carefully folded napkin, delicate and impossible to unravel. The orchestra rises, and suddenly the music is louder than the whispers. You notice the interplay between notes and nods, between melody and menace. Each string, each drumbeat seems to underline a subtle truth. Versailles is a symphony of ambition, and every performer, musician, noble, or servant has a part to play. You sip your wine, tasting the sharp tang of strategy alongside the sweetness of dessert, and wonder whether anyone here can ever relax. Historians still argue whether these lavish performances masked real danger or merely magnified its theater. But you feel the tension as you would the vibrations of a drum beneath your feet. Across the hall, masked figures glide among the tables. The masquerade is not only for spectacle, it allows courtiers to test secrets, deliver coded messages, and perhaps toy with intrigue undetected. A whisper claims that one masked man once gathered information so valuable that the king himself almost raised an eyebrow in alarm. You glance at the masked musicians, half convinced that they're taking mental notes for some hidden score of scandal. The dishes continue to parade before you, each more elaborate than the last. Roast swans carved into impossible shapes, candied fruits sculpted into mythological beasts, and tiny pastries layered with cream as delicate as lace. You try one, and the flavors collide like courtiers at a poorly timed compliment, sweet, bitter, subtle, yet with a lingering aftertaste of power. The culinary artistry here isn't merely indulgence, it's a statement. Every morsel announces dominance, wealth, and sophistication, reminding you that in Versailles, food is as political as a decree from the king himself. You notice the subtle interplay of glances across the table. The Comte de Guiche leans toward a diplomat, a note of flirtation in his tone, while the ladies of the court exchange looks that could kill or save a fortune. It's said that Louis XIV often used these moments to gauge loyalty, to measure ambitions, or simply to amuse himself. The line between pleasure and strategy blurs so completely that you cannot tell whether a laugh is genuine or a weapon cloaked in silk. Somewhere near the corner, a servant almost drops a silver tureen, and for a second the room freezes. You can hear the collective heartbeat of the court, an invisible tension binding them as tightly as the king binds his subjects. A small mistake, unnoticed by most, could ripple through the entire hierarchy like a minor earthquake. You remember the stories of past banquets where even a misplaced napkin sparked scandal, and you shiver just slightly. Music swells again, louder now, drowning out a whispered accusation about a hidden affair or a secret bribe. The notes feel almost protective, covering sins and secrets as much as they entertain. You realize the orchestra is not merely accompaniment, it is camouflage, a velvet curtain for intrigue. And you, in your chair, are both observer and participant in a performance so intricate that it might collapse under the weight of its own elegance. A fleeting rumor drifts across your table. Someone claims that a masked dancer was once caught carrying poison in a silk pouch. Though no evidence survives, you imagine the tension of the hall if the king had noticed. You imagine the thrill of watching everyone pretend it didn't exist. The danger is delicious, like sugar on the tongue, bitter and thrilling all at once. You glance at Louis XIV again. He lifts his fork with deliberate grace, as if conducting both music and loyalty simultaneously. You can't tell if he's playing a game or merely savoring the flavors of life. Perhaps, at Versailles, the two are inseparable. And you, caught between curiosity and awe, realize that the melodies and the morsels are inseparable too. Every note, every taste, every gesture conspires to remind you that this is a kingdom ruled as much by art as by authority. Night deepens, and the banquets slowly blur into after-dinner masquerades. You stumble into the transition, senses still tingling from candlelight, perfumes, and the lingering sweetness of wine. The orchestra continues, but now it seems to drift above the heads of dancers and courtiers, weaving through arches and gilded mirrors, as though the music itself has secrets to share. Midnight here isn't dark, it's luminous, drenched in crystal chandeliers, powdered wigs, and whispered promises that might be broken before sunrise. You wander past tables now deserted of plates, but littered with delicate crumbs of strategy, folded napkins hiding messages, a glass still half full with someone's ambition, a fan dropped like a soft declaration of intent. The ladies of the court glide past, gowns swishing like gentle rivers, their eyes flicking between the king and his courtiers. One murmurs to her companion that the new ambassador has already misstepped an errant bow. A too quick sip of wine, and the ripple of scandal is already reaching the corners of Versailles. Historians still argue whether these nightly whispers shaped policy or merely entertained the Sun King. But watching them, you feel both fear and fascination in equal measure. You notice that every step is a negotiation. You pass a masked dancer whose eyes glint with mischief, and you swear for a moment that he knows your secrets. The ladies nod politely, curtsying with precision, though the glances they exchange are far more instructive than their words. One duchess teases another with the subtle tilt of her head, hinting at a liaison no one dares confirm, while a nearby marquis pretends not to notice. The dance floor becomes a chessboard, each movement calculated, each touch a statement. Somewhere behind you, a fountain gurgles softly, scented with roses and anise, a serene counterpoint to the carefully measured chaos of the court. You remember the tales of midnight duels sparked by words whispered too loudly, of lovers exiled over a glance, and of servants caught passing notes that might as well have been royal decrees. These walls have heard everything, and yet they keep their secrets as stubbornly as a mother hen guards her chicks. The air is thick with perfumes that almost mask the tension beneath. You inhale jasmine, amber, and a hint of orange blossom, only to realize the scent itself is a language. One sniff reveals flirtation, another ambition. yet another carefully hidden resentment. You marvel at how the senses are manipulated here, as deliberately as the positions of guests at the king's table. A whisper floats past. The Sun King watches closely. Even now, even in the midst of music and laughter, you glance toward the center of the hall and see him, his expression calm yet attentive, noting each gesture and gauging loyalty, amusement, or fear. Every smile, every lifted glass, every carefully concealed sigh flows into his orbit, and you suddenly feel the gravity of Versailles not just in its architecture or opulence, but in its control over the human spirit. A playful rumor sweeps through the dancers. A masked count supposedly replaced sugar with salt in a rival's dessert, just to observe the fallout. You laugh softly, but the laughter carries an edge, because in this palace, even humor can wound. You sip your wine again, tasting the thrill of midnight, the sweetness of whispers, and the bitter undertone of ambition. By the time dawn approaches, the masquerade feels endless. Perfume lingers in your hair, laughter echoes in your ears, and somewhere, someone has undoubtedly won or lost an empire with a flick of a fan. You start to understand that at Versailles, the banquets never truly end. They simply fold into the next performance, a continuous river of candles, music, and scandal. You begin to notice the subtle ways Louis XIV wields control. Even as the laughter and music continue round you, the Sun King doesn't merely feed his court. He tames it like a lion pacing in a gilded cage. Courtiers rise and fall according to the flow of dishes, the tilt of a goblet, or the inflection in a jest. You sip your wine, realizing that the empire is as much on this table as it is in the provinces, and that every morsel carries a message. Historians still argue whether Louis's obsession with banquets was tyranny disguised as pleasure, or art disguised as politics, but you feel both. The tables stretch endlessly, each silver platter a statement of wealth and influence. Nobles glance nervously at the king, gauging whether a smile means favor or a fleeting disapproval. You notice the subtleties, a tilt of the head, a careful pause before taking a bite, a fan raised just enough to obscure intent. Even dessert is a lesson in obedience. Candied fruits shaped into lions, eagles, and crowns, reminding everyone that the Sun King watches. Always. You catch sight of a minor noble, sweating under the weight of his wig, trying desperately to appear relaxed as the Comtesse de Soissons engages him in conversation. One wrong answer could undo years of carefully cultivated alliances. You wonder how he keeps track of all the hidden rules, the unspoken etiquette, the invisible hierarchies, the tiny gestures that determine life and death in terms of favor. Here, a dropped spoon can ruin a career. A misaligned glass can topple a fortune. Behind the sparkling veneer, the king's power flows subtly. A well-placed toast elevates one courtier. A barely perceptible sigh diminishes another. You realize that Versailles is less a home than a laboratory for control, where every flavor, every laugh, every gesture is part of an elaborate experiment in dominance. One scholar might argue that Louis XIV's banquets were a masterclass in social engineering. Another might insist they were merely indulgent spectacle. You decide to believe a little of both. You notice the courtiers nibbling at sugar cubes, delicately carved confections, and other extravagances. Each bite is a performance, a test of restraint, an exercise in the theater of submission. Meanwhile, the king's own plate remains a center of gravity, gold and porcelain commanding attention. His choices rippling outward like sunlight across a polished floor. Even the orchestra seems to adjust to him, swelling when he lifts a glass, softening when he leans back. You watch as the ladies whisper, and the gentlemen respond with careful nods. Everyone is calculating, assessing, plotting, though they pretend otherwise. Even laughter becomes strategic, a tool to flatter, distract, or mislead. You remember that tale about the sugar-coated seeds, and suddenly you imagine the entire palace as one giant confection, sweet, intricate, and potentially lethal if chewed the wrong way. The night drifts toward early morning. Servants quietly clear the last remnants of dishes while the orchestra plays its final notes. Almost apologetically, you feel the invisible threads of control, woven so tightly that the palace itself seems to breathe with authority. And in that moment, you understand, Louis XIV didn't merely host banquets, he engineered obedience. cultivated all, and, above all, reminded everyone that at Versailles, the sun never sets, the final course arrives, and the hall is heavy with exhaustion and exhilaration. You watch the courtiers, their powdered faces glistening with candlelight, their smiles carefully calibrated. Even the music slows, bending toward a gentle cadence that echoes the settling of bodies and spirits alike. Louis XIV raises his glass, the gesture both simple and monumental. The Sun King's eyes sweep across the room, and you sense a wave of authority, warmth, and subtle intimidation all at once. He is magnificent, yet you can't help but notice a shadow beneath the brilliance, perhaps fatigue. Perhaps the quiet hollow of endless performance. The dishes have grown quieter now, less about spectacle and more about indulgence. The last of the roast swans and delicate pates disappear under careful hands, leaving crumbs that sparkle faintly under the candlelight. Someone murmurs about the exotic spices still lingering on the air, their origins from lands none of the courtiers will ever see. You breathe deeply, tasting the essence of the empire, sweet, exotic, intoxicating, and just slightly bitter at the edges. Historians still argue whether these banquets were displays of cultural mastery or indulgent vanity, and you feel the truth waver somewhere between both. The courtiers have begun to drift, murmuring promises, half-lies, and faint threats beneath the hush of departing music. A lady adjusts her fan, as if the delicate instrument can shield her from observation. A young marquis straightens his jacket for the 100th time, trying to lock in favor that might evaporate with the final candle. You notice how every glance, every gesture, every small movement has been registered by invisible registers of power, catalogued silently by the ever-watchful Sun King. Even the orchestra seems to sigh as the last notes fade, leaving only the soft rustle of silk and the occasional clink of a remaining goblet. You feel the shift in the room, the transition from performance to quiet reflection, the moment when opulence begins to fade and human fatigue asserts itself. Yet despite the exhaustion, you sense an underlying energy, a pride that the palace pulses with, as if Versailles itself refuses to sleep completely. The king raises his glass one last time, and you see a glimmer of both triumph and fragility. The empire has dined, danced, and schemed for another night, and you realize that these banquets, though glorious, are also fleeting. One morning, a plate will be left empty, a chair vacant, a smile absent. And yet, for now, the grandeur persists, the music, the mirrors, the laughter, all preserved in memory like sugar crystallized on a tart. You rise, letting the echoes of the night settle around you. Versailles feels alive and exhausted, powerful and delicate, like a living organism nourished by ambition, indulgence, and a touch of madness. You remember the stories, the whispers, the hidden gestures, and the small rebellions, crumbs of resistance beneath the weight of gold. And you understand that for all its scandal, all its opulence, the Sun King's table is as human as it is divine, a reflection of desire, power, and the endless dance of those who dared to sit at it. The hall is quiet now, the candles burned low, their glow softened to a gentle warmth that brushes against your skin like a sigh. You sit back, letting the memory of the feast settle around you. The clatter of plates, the shimmer of gowns, the subtle glances, and whispered secrets all fade into a gentle hum, like the last vibration of a string slowly returning to rest. You breathe in, tasting the lingering perfumes of rose, orange blossom, and roasted game, and feel yourself drifting between the opulence you witnessed and the calm that follows it. The palace, massive and gleaming, no longer feels intimidating. Its walls, mirrors, and chandeliers seem almost gentle in the hush of the night, the grandeur softened into quiet reflection. You imagine the servants and courtiers slowly returning to their chambers, the music finally stilled, and the distant sun ready to rise on another day of spectacle. The excess, the laughter, the tension, all the drama has temporarily passed, leaving a kind of serene awe in its wake. Your mind wanders to the Sun King himself. Louis XIV, at the center of it all, must have felt both satisfaction and fatigue, the weight of his kingdom pressing even on his most golden moments. You think about the dances, the dishes, the whispered plots, and the careful gestures, and you realize that Versailles was not just a palace, it was a living organism, pulsing with ambition, desire, and human longing. Even now, the memory of the banquet feels alive, as if the echoes of laughter and music could shimmer back into being with a single thought. You close your eyes briefly and imagine the soft sound of the orchestra, the shimmer of silk, the glint of polished silver. The palace seems to breathe with you, its grand opulence now a quiet companion rather than a spectacle. You feel comforted, as if you've been allowed a private glimpse into a world both magnificent and fleeting. A reminder that beauty, ambition, and human curiosity often intertwine. And as you drift into a gentle calm, the lingering scents, tastes, and whispers of Versailles settle like a soft blanket around your senses. You let the glow of memory and imagination fade slowly, carrying with you the echo of grandeur, the warmth of intrigue, and the quiet reassurance that even the most dazzling excess eventually softens into serenity.